pledge allegiance to the flag. No. Ready, begin? Remember that? Okay. All right. So right now we're going to talk about some kind of concepts and ideas that designers use. It's not just architects. That's really an unfair statement that the person that developed this PowerPoint put up there. Because other designers use these things. Okay? I'm going to run through them real quickly, and then we're going to go take a closer look at each of them. So there is this French word, French, right? Partie, right? Which means some sort of a genesis idea or an organizational concept that leads to sort of the shape of the building, right? Or the object. There is a second thing which deals with form and geometry. So looking at the shape of things and its geometric composition. A third thing is scale, which is how big something is relative to what? The human body. I'm doing my Buzz Lightyear imitation with my hands straight out there. Another one is proportion, right? And proportion generally means a ratio. So how many of you are good with ratios? No? Who likes math here? No? Oh, I got three of them. All right. So ratio. So the proportion of something that is, if you're looking at it from a distance and it's really, really wide, not very tall, is got one type of proportion. And if you're looking at it from a distance and it looked like that big rock that was sticking up, it's narrow but really tall, that has a very different proportion, right? Okay. Another one that I'm going to modify and change, and is misspelled, by the way. It's not axes as in axe murderers. It's supposed to be axes, A-X-I-S, symmetry. Is going to be axes, symmetry, and asymmetry. All right, so I will try and expand upon that. I'm not even sure that asymmetry is spelled correctly. I didn't develop these, so. Another aspect in understanding architecture is path and circulation. How do you get through it? How do you get to it? Right? How are things linked up inside of it? And then finally, one other thing that you guys will be using in order to kind of analyze architecture is, where is its enclosure? And what level of enclosure? So you guys can all kind of picture a Greek temple, right? So did they have like nice double glazed aluminum framed or vinyl framed windows between the columns back then? They didn't, did they? And so when we talk about enclosure, we're talking about relative enclosure, in particular when we're looking at, ancient civilizations. Yeah, some people made glass out of mica sheets or something like that. But for the most part, they didn't have glass until, it wasn't really completely prevalent until the Industrial Revolution. And so when we talk about enclosure, we're talking about the relationship of what would be inside to outside. Okay? And areas that are maybe partially outside but partially inside. A porch, for example. Temples had porches. All right, so let's take a look at partie and organization. See if I can get this to work. All right? So according to Francis D.K. Ching, which is one of the books that is used in architectural education, one of the ways of thinking of partie might be by its organizational pattern. And so he lists about 5 different organizational patterns, things that could be a linear form, things that could be a centralized form, things that could be set up in grids, right? And then things that could be radial. I remember I used to have a hard time between radial and centralized. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between those two later. And then finally, clustered form. And each of these different sort of organizational patterns yields a different sort of visual character to the object that's being made. Okay? So right there is a linear example of a temple, this being the elevation and this being the plan of it, so you can understand why it was that we had to talk about the two. So you can see the relationship of the objects in elevation to the plan. They line up. There's the stairs, there's the stairs, there's the tall element in the back. Okay? You can even start to see subsets of things. For example, that little protrusion right there is that little porch right there. Okay? You start to relate this notion of elevation to plan, plan to section. But these are ways of organizing something that are going to make the object or building look a certain way, right? If I take something and I cluster it, it's not going to look anything like a linear form. So those are what I would term sort of Euclidean ways of organizing something. They're methods that lend themselves to old mathematics, Euclidean mathematics, where things had a center point. It could be established as a square, a rectangle, a radius. The idea of part T goes beyond that and can be sort of extrapolated to very sort of complex lengths, right? Here, I believe, is a building by Toyo Ito. You see his kind of conceptual sketches. Mr. Ito, I believe, is Japanese. Yeah, Toyo Ito, right there. January 1995. Okay? And there's his sort of conceptual sketches of the idea of all these slabs of a building having these openings that sort of flow through each one of them. And then here you see the kind of final manifestation on one of the floor levels of all of those tubes kind of running down through the building. Okay? Talking about symmetry, asymmetry, balance. Most of you mastered symmetry or had a strong grasp of it at about that tall. You could draw a happy face. You could draw a little house with a door in the middle and 2 windows to either side of it. You could draw a Christmas tree, right? So the idea of symmetry is something that's not that hard to understand. It has a center line or an axis around which 2 things are symmetrical. They're balanced, right? And there are all sorts of different types of symmetry. So here we see 2 examples of sort of architecture. One of them is very symmetrical, right? Capitol building. And the other one is very asymmetrical. I believe it's a housing complex by Frank Gehry. Okay? So the 2 of them are kind of at diametric sort of positions from each other. A lot of the buildings that we'll look at in ancient times wanted symmetry, but they developed in a sort of organic fashion. And so even though there might be straight lines in it and stuff, they weren't this perfectly symmetrical thing because things developed based on like where somebody had walked for 20 years and that's where the road was, and it was at a little bit different angle than a road further over from it. So there are in these ancient things that are axial and symmetrical, and there are other things that are not, that are sort of more haphazardly developed. Okay? So another one of those things that was in that initial list of all those things, those key architectural concepts, is the form of a building. Okay? So here we see the Colosseum, right? And it is essentially, right, the way you see the Colosseum nowadays, it looks like it's like this complex thing with all these layers and stuff. The reality was that that's not what it looked like, right, when they were killing people in it. All right, which is what they did in there. They killed people. They did other stuff in there too, but I got to visit it last summer, and listening to some of the stuff that went on there was just creepy. Creepy. You know, one of the guys that was talking was saying, yeah, the stench from the blood and the dying things got so bad that they had to have these huge incense burners so that people wouldn't get nauseous and throw up. Yeah, weird. Lots and lots of people died there. That was part of the whole Roman thing. Anyway, so when we look at form, right, we can think of it in sort of 4 subcategories, right? So one kind of form is geometric, right? So all of you have seen drums. All of you have seen like little pyramids or something, or you've all held a block of something. Yes? So those are pure geometric forms. Other types of forms are additive, where you take a bunch of pieces and you kind of bring them together in some way. It could be linear, it could be clustered. Okay? That relates back to the organizational part, T part. Subtractive form. So one way to kind of approach something is to say, I'm going to make this big cylinder and I'm going to cut all of these archways out of it, these openings out of it. That's subtractive form. And then finally, this idea of biomorphic form, which can also be called organic form, all right, which is things that do not have a Euclidean geometry, things that are more curvilinear and warped in nature without a center point. Anybody know what a NURBS is? NURBS? Non-uniform rational B-spline. Anyway, if you ever play around with Illustrator or stuff, they have little NURBS curves, and you grab the little handlebars and twist things around, right? But that's what our human bodies are. We don't have perfect radii anywhere, right? Nature doesn't have a lot of perfect radii. It has these complex curvatures that are constantly changing. And that relates back to organic or biometric form. All right? So when we look at form and we talk about simple primary geometries, we talk about the cylinder or drum, the pyramid, the cube, the rectangular solid, and the sphere. Right? Those are all kind of simple Euclidean geometries. And there's lots and lots of buildings that have been built, right, based upon those geometries. So you look at this sketch of ancient Rome and you see a lot of those geometries there. There's pyramids, there are cylinders, there are half spheres and domes, there's cylinders, there's all sorts of stuff like that. And it's not just in ancient times that they were used, because right here, how many of you guys have gone to Hollywood? Anybody been to Hollywood? That's in Hollywood, right? The Capitol Records building. That is essentially a drum. Right? Never mind. This is the entrance to the Louvre by I.M. Pei, and it's essentially a glass pyramid. Okay? So those are all primary geometries, simple geometries. Okay? And so remember, this is going back. I'm going to back up here for a minute. Right? So you remember those four categories we just talked about? So there's geometric, additive, subtractive, and biomorphic. So that's sort of what we're progressing through. So that was the primary forms. So now we'll take a look at additive forms and this idea that you can create a formal geometry by adding a bunch of pieces together. And that creates a very different character than the geometric forms, right? The geometric forms you kind of immediately understand. And it's like, oh, that's a drum, that's a cylinder, that's a pyramid. Even though it might have details and stuff, you still understand it as that shape. These are different because these get much, 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 much more complex because there's more parts. So, I guess I better stop this or else. And stop.